Good evening, and welcome back to Untold Nightmares. Tonight, we're heading deep into the Appalachian backroads, places where the map fades, the mountains close in, and strange towns appear that shouldn't exist at all. These aren't ghost stories told around campfires. These are chilling accounts from forgotten ridges, haunted hollows, and communities swallowed by time. Stories of vanished highways, voices that call your name in the dark, and churches that should have stayed buried. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Nightmares for true-style horror every day. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Tap the bell so you never miss when we open the door to the unknown. Now, let's begin with our first tale, The Vanishing Lights of Pine Hollow, a town you'll never find on any map, but one that may still be waiting for you. This happened in the fall of 2014, though when I think back on it, the memory is so sharp it might as well have happened last night. I was 24 then, still young enough to believe road trips at 2 a.m. were a good idea, still dumb enough to think I was invincible behind the wheel of my rattling old Honda Accord. Back then, life felt wide open. I had just finished college, landed a job in Northern Virginia, and was trying to convince myself I was an adult. Though, if I'm honest, I was still the same restless kid who couldn't sit still when the chance of adventure was dangled in front of me. And Tyler knew that about me. Tyler had been my best friend since high school, the guy who always managed to get me into something. He had the kind of confidence that made people follow along, even when they knew better. If he said he knew a shortcut, you let him lead. If he said the party would be worth it, you went, even if it was 3 towns over. He was reckless in a way that was magnetic, and it got him into trouble plenty of times, but it also made life more interesting. That's how he got me out on the road that Thursday night. Tyler had scored tickets to the Tennessee-Florida game in Knoxville, and instead of waiting until Friday morning like sane people, he decided we should drive through the night, beat the traffic, and roll into town ahead of everyone else. His girlfriend Casey was coming too, quieter than Tyler, the kind of person who preferred a blanket and a book to all-night chaos. But she went along with his plans anyway. Maybe she was just used to it. We left around 11. The car smelled like Taco Bell because Tyler had insisted on one last fast food run before we hit the highway, and the greasy bags sat crumpled in the back. Casey was already curled up against the door, earbuds in, blanket over her shoulders. Tyler had a thermos of gas station coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, talking about how this game was going to be legendary. I drove, hands tight on the wheel, following the endless chain of red taillights down I-81. For the first couple of hours, everything was fine. I liked driving at night. The darkness made the world feel smaller. Like the only thing that mattered was the ribbon of road in front of me. The drone of tires, the faint static of the radio, the occasional 18-wheeler blasting past. It was calming in a weird way. But somewhere south of Roanoke, Tyler leaned forward with that look on his face, the one that always meant trouble. He tapped the GPS on his phone and said, "Hey, I know a shortcut." Casey groaned from the back without opening her eyes. "Not tonight, Ty, please." But he was already grinning. "No, seriously, look. This county road cuts through the mountains. Saves us like an hour. We'll miss all the trucks, no traffic, straight shot." I should have said no. I should have stayed on the interstate. But Tyler's confidence had a way of bulldozing over hesitation, and before I knew it, I was taking the exit. The difference was immediate. The glow of the interstate vanished behind us, and suddenly we were on a narrow 2-lane road hemmed in by dense trees. The asphalt looked cracked, patched in places where time had chewed it apart. My headlights tunneled ahead, catching glimpses of mist curling through the hollows. At first, it felt like the kind of scene you'd see on a postcard. Quiet Appalachian woods, the smell of pine drifting faintly through the vents. But the longer we drove, the heavier it felt. We didn't pass a single other car. No roadside signs. No glow of farmhouses through the trees. Just blackness and the endless press of forest. After 20 minutes, Casey pulled her earbuds out and leaned forward. "Are we even on the map?" she asked, voice low. Tyler waved his phone. "Relax. 40 miles, we'll be back on the interstate, trust me." But his grin looked thinner now, like even he was trying to convince himself. We drove another 10 minutes in silence. That's when he pointed out the windshield. "See? Civilization. Told you." I squinted, and sure enough, there were lights ahead. Faint at first, a yellow glow through the trees, but growing brighter as we drew closer. Not headlights, not a farmhouse porch, a cluster of lights like a small town. By the time the trees opened, my breath caught in my throat. It was a town, but not like any I'd ever seen. A gas station on the corner with an old Gulf sign. A diner with a neon open 24 hours, buzzing faintly. 2 rows of narrow houses climbing the hillside, their porches lit with amber bulbs. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time around 1965. And there were people. Figures on porches, silhouettes in windows. A man standing at the gas pump. Every single one of them turned to watch us. Not waving, not smiling, just staring, their heads following our car in eerie unison. My foot eased off the gas. The silence was suffocating. For a town so lit up, there was no sound. No TV through an open window, no dogs barking, not even crickets. Just the hum of my engine. Casey whispered, "Don't stop. Please, just keep going." But Tyler leaned forward, eyes wide with excitement. "Look at this place. Coffee at the diner, stretch our legs. Come on, man. It'll be fine." I hesitated, torn between his bravado and Casey's fear. Finally, against my gut, I pulled into the diner's gravel lot. Through the windows, a single waitress stood behind the counter. She was tall and thin, with her hair piled high in a style that belonged to another decade. She was already facing the door, perfectly still, as though she'd been waiting. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering something we couldn't hear. Casey gripped the seat in front of her. "Don't you dare, Tyler." But he was already unbuckling. "Relax. I'll be right back." The instant his foot touched the gravel, the entire town went dark. Every light, the diner, the street lamps, the houses. One moment Pine Hollow glowed in warm amber. The next, it was swallowed in black so complete I couldn't see the hood of my car. Casey screamed. Tyler cursed and scrambled back in. My hand shook as I jammed the gear shift into reverse. The tires spun, gravel sprang, and we shot back onto the road. For a split second, in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement. Figures stepping off porches, shadows gliding into the street. But the black swallowed them before I could be sure. We drove blind, headlights carving tunnels through fog, until at last a green interstate sign loomed out of the dark. I nearly cried with relief. At the rest stop, none of us spoke for a long time. Casey was trembling, eyes wet. Tyler, pale, stared at his hands. My own pulse still pounded in my ears. Finally, Tyler forced a weak laugh. "Okay, so that was weird." We checked the GPS. According to it, there was nothing where we'd just been. No town, no diner, just forest. That night in Knoxville, I barely slept. Even after the game, after the bars, after trying to drown the memory in noise and distraction, I lay in the motel staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of what we'd seen. I could still see that waitress, lips moving soundlessly behind the glass, her eyes boring into me. I could still feel the weight of all those stares from the porches and windows. Tyler tried to shrug it off. That was his way. "Just some old town," he muttered, while brushing his teeth. "Weird people, weird timing. We got spooked, that's all." But I noticed how his voice shook, how he kept glancing at the curtains, like he was afraid that warm amber glow would seep through the edges. Casey wouldn't even argue. She sat on the edge of the bed wrapped in her blanket, Earbuds in, but no music playing, staring at the floor. She jumped every time someone walked past our door. The game the next day felt like a blur. Tens of thousands of people screaming in the stadium, music blasting, sunshine beating down. And all I could think about was that town. I don't even remember who won. That night, over dinner, I pulled Tyler's phone across the table and made him pull up the map. I wanted to see it again, to prove to myself it existed. He hesitated, then handed it over. I zoomed in on the stretch of road we'd taken. There it was, the county road, winding through green hills. But no town, no gas station, no diner, just forest. Maybe it was a ghost town, Tyler said weakly. You know, abandoned mining place or something. Not on modern maps. Then why were the lights on? I asked. He didn't answer. We drove back Sunday afternoon, and this time I refused to leave the interstate. Tyler didn't argue. Casey stayed wrapped in her blanket, watching the trees fly by in silence. The car felt heavier somehow, like all three of us were carrying something unspoken. For a while, I tried to forget. But Pine Hollow wasn't finished with us. The first thing happened a week later. I was driving to work early, the sun barely up, when the radio cut out. 1 second it was sports talk. The next it was static. I twisted the dial, searching, but every station was the same. White noise. And under it, faint but unmistakable, was a voice. A woman's voice, whispering. The sound prickled my skin. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was identical to the way the waitress's lips had been moving in that diner window. My hands went clammy on the wheel. I slammed the radio off and drove the rest of the way in silence, heart pounding. 2 nights later, Casey called me. Her voice was trembling. I saw them, she whispered. The lights. She'd been driving home from class, cutting across a rural road near Winchester. Through the trees, she swore she saw that same amber glow clustered like a town tucked into the hills. She didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She just kept driving until she reached town, then pulled into a grocery store parking lot and cried until she could breathe again. They're still out there, she said. I know it. I told Tyler, but he brushed me off. Coincidence, he said. She saw some farm. You're letting it get to you. But I caught him staring at his phone later, scrolling maps again, muttering under his breath. It wasn't supposed to be there. That's when I started digging. I went to the library, scoured old county maps. I searched ghost town registries online, local history forums, even old newspapers. Nothing. No Pine Hollow. No mention of a diner, a gas station, a collapse, a relocation. Nothing. It was like the place had never existed. But people knew. One evening, I drove back out toward the mountains and stopped at a rundown gas station near the county line. The clerk was an older man with a lined face and a heavy Appalachian accent, the kind of man who looked like he'd lived his whole life in those hills. I asked him casually if he'd ever heard of Pine Hollow. He froze. His hand, halfway to giving me change, stopped. His eyes lifted to mine, sharp and wary. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he shoved the bills into my hand and muttered, "Best not to ask about places you ain't meant to find." I pressed him, asked if he knew where it was. He shook his head quickly. "Keep your wheels on the highway, son. That's my advice." Then he turned away, making it clear the conversation was over. That night I dreamed of Pine Hollow. I dreamed I was driving alone through endless trees, the road unspooling forever, when a warm glow appeared through the mist. The town rose before me, perfect and silent, every window lit. And on the diner's porch stood the waitress, smiling now, lips moving. Only this time, I could hear her. She was whispering my name. I woke, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. After that, it got worse. Street lamps flickering out as I drove beneath them. Static on the radio whenever I passed through wooded stretches. Once, while pulling into my driveway, I glanced in the mirror and swore I saw a faint amber light glowing at the far end of the street. Tyler started drinking more. Casey stopped driving back roads altogether. And me, I started feeling watched. One night, leaving work late, I cut through a rural highway. It was foggy, the kind of night where visibility shrinks to nothing, and my headlights carved narrow tunnels through the mist. That's when I saw it. Faint, through the trees, that glow. My stomach flipped. It was Pine Hollow. I knew it instantly. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it, to keep my eyes on the road, but something pulled at me, a weight in my chest urging me to turn, to follow, to see. My hands trembled on the wheel. For a terrifying moment, I actually slowed down. Then a horn blared behind me. A semi barreling up through the fog. The sound jolted me like ice water. I stomped the gas and tore forward, refusing to glance back. By the time I reached town, the glow was gone. I told no one about that night. But the truth is, Pine Hollow isn't gone. It isn't forgotten. It's still there, waiting in the folds of those mountains. You won't find it on a map, but if you take the wrong road at the wrong time of night, you might stumble into it like we did. And if you do, if you see that amber glow bleeding through the trees, if you see those faces turning to watch, whatever you do, don't stop. Keep driving. Because Pine Hollow doesn't let you go. Black Elk Ridge was the kind of place that felt older than time. The mountain rose crooked and sheer out of the low Appalachian valleys, its spine covered in pine and fog, and its hollows sinking into shadows even at noon. Locals would tell you the ridge wasn't a destination, it was a boundary. You didn't go onto it unless you had no other choice, and you sure as hell didn't camp there overnight. The mountain had its own reputation. Missing hunters, hikers, who lost entire weekends wandering its switchbacks, kids daring each other to touch the weathered trailhead sign and then running back screaming. In my town, it was whispered about more like a rumor than a landmark. And like most people in their 20s, I thought warnings were just superstitions wrapped in backwoods folklore. I'd been restless that summer, caught between jobs and trying to shake off the suffocating weight of small-town routine. A few nights of camping alone on the ridge sounded like an antidote. My mother tried to talk me out of it. She told me stories my grandmother used to tell her. Of a ridge that whispered your name if you lingered too long. Of a cave that breathed cold air no matter the season. Of people who followed voices into the dark and never came back. I laughed it off, threw my pack into the trunk of my car, and drove toward the mountain with that same naive confidence that has undone a lot of people my age. The dirt parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty when I pulled in. Just one old Ford pickup sat at the far corner, bed filled with rusted tools and a chained-up cooler. The air was already cooler than it had been in town, with the scent of pine sap heavy enough to cling to your clothes. The wooden trail sign was warped, its paint faded, but the carved words were still legible. Black Elk Ridge, use at your own risk. Nailed to the post beneath it was a second board, rough pine planks with names carved into the surface. The gouges were deep, some letters barely legible with age. Each name had a year beside it. 78, 84, 92, 2001, 2013. The most recent was less than 3 years old. It didn't look like anything the Park Service would maintain. It looked more like a warning left by the ridge itself, a tally of those it had taken. I should have turned around right then. But arrogance is louder than fear when you're young, so I shouldered my pack and started walking. The trail climbed quickly, winding through trees that pressed closer with each turn. The ground was uneven, roots like veins pushing up through the soil, and stones slick with moss made every step careful work. The forest had that uncanny Appalachian silence. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots and the ragged sound of my breathing. Even when the wind moved, the trees hardly seemed to stir, as if they were listening rather than swaying. An hour in, I passed the only other people I'd see that day. An older couple making their way down. Their clothes were worn and utilitarian, the kind of hikers who looked like they'd been doing this for decades. They stopped when they saw me. The man asked how far I was going, and when I told him I planned to spend 2 nights on the ridge, his expression changed. Not mockery, not dismissal. Just a long, heavy silence. "You best keep your ears shut after dark," he said finally, then took his wife's arm and moved past without another word. That sentence followed me the rest of the climb. By dusk, I'd reached a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. The view was breathtaking, layers of hills stretching into haze, the sky painted orange and violet as the sun dropped behind the ridge. I pitched my tent there, boiled water for instant noodles, and watched the day die. The silence deepened with the dark. Not even the wind seemed willing to move. When I finally crawled into the tent and zipped it shut, I thought maybe exhaustion would knock me out. It didn't. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the pressure of silence pressing against the thin nylon walls. My thoughts started to blur and drift, and just as sleep was finally reaching me, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, almost like a breath carried on the air. At first I thought it was my imagination, a scrap of dream intruding. But then it came again. Clearer, closer. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling my name. I sat bolt upright, ears straining. The sound came from the trees beyond the tent, too far to be an echo, too distinct to be the wind. My hand shook as I unzipped the flap and shined my headlamp into the woods. The beam cut across trunks and brush, but nothing moved. Nothing human anyway. "Hello?" I called, and instantly regretted it. My voice sounded fragile in the emptiness. A pebble dropped into a bottomless well. No answer came, just the weight of silence folding in again. I ducked back into the tent, zipped it up, and lay there, sweating, heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew. I hadn't been asleep. I hadn't been dreaming. When dawn came, the world looked normal again. Blue sky, dew on the tent fly, birds finally daring to sing. I packed up, laughed at myself for being spooked, and pushed farther along the ridge. But the laughter didn't last long. By midday, I reached a place where the trail bent hard around a slope, and there, half hidden in the rock face, was a cave. Its mouth was wide enough for 3 people to walk through side by side, jagged edges like teeth biting into the air. The rock around it was scarred with soot, as if fire had licked its surface long ago. Someone had hammered a wooden cross into the ground just beside the entrance. The wood was gray with age, but carved into its surface were letters cut deep and angry. Leave. Cold air breathed from the cave, unnatural in the June heat. It smelled of wet stone and something metallic, something sour. I didn't go near it. I didn't even want to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me as I walked on, that the mountain itself had opened its mouth and was waiting. That night, I camped farther up the ridge. My nerves were already raw, and when darkness fell, it felt like the air itself grew heavier, pressing against my skin. Sometime after midnight, I woke to whispers. Not one voice this time. Many. Layered and overlapping, murmuring just beyond the tent walls. I couldn't understand the words, but they rose and fell like a tide, circling me, closing in. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't drifting past. They were surrounding me. Then, clear above the rest, came the same woman's voice. It spoke my name again, sweet, urgent, pulling. The canvas of the tent seemed too thin to keep anything out. My limbs felt heavy, my chest pinned by an invisible weight, and for a moment I thought I might unzip the flap and step out into the dark without even choosing to. The pull was that strong, like invisible hands tugging me towards something I couldn't see. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers faded. Silence rushed in like a vacuum. I was left gasping, tears streaking my face without even realizing I'd been crying. At first light, I broke camp and started down. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I didn't care about the view. I just wanted out. But when I reached the junction where the trail should have descended into the valley, it wasn't there. The blazes painted on the trees, the faint line of soil tamped by boots, gone, vanished. Every direction I turned was just wall after wall of forest, stretching endlessly. And that's when I heard it again. The voice, calling me from far down the slope, the same woman's voice, sweet and patient, as if she knew I'd come eventually. The direction was unmistakable. It was coming from the cave. The sound of that voice calling from the direction of the cave rooted me in place. It was the same tone I had heard the night before, calm, coaxing, like someone who already knew I'd obey. I spun in a slow circle, desperate for some sign of the real trail, but the woods offered nothing. No painted blaze, no trampled path, no hint of the way down. The forest looked identical in every direction. Thick trunks pressed shoulder to shoulder, shadows clutching at the ground. I tried to steady my breathing and told myself to use logic. If I couldn't find the markers, I could at least keep heading west, back toward the side I'd climbed. But as I started walking, my compass needle began spinning without stopping, twitching wildly like it couldn't find north at all. That was when panic truly set in. The whispers began again, faint at first, like threads of sound weaving between the branches. They overlapped in 100 indistinguishable voices, rising and falling without words. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just around me, it was inside me. My pulse thudded in my skull until I thought it might burst. Then came the shift. The murmurs sharpened into familiar tones. I heard my mother's voice, calling me by the childhood nickname only she ever used. Then my best friend's voice, echoing from the trees. Then my ex-girlfriend, speaking with the same sweetness I used to hear before everything fell apart. Each voice called from a different direction, but they all carried the same message, the same pull. Come down. Come closer. Come into the dark. I stumbled forward, covering my ears, but no matter which direction I turned, the voices followed, circling, tightening, and soon they all blurred together again, overlapping in a rising tide that pressed against my skull until I thought I'd collapse. By late afternoon, exhausted and disoriented, I found myself standing once more at the cave. The ridge had led me in a circle, or maybe it had just been pulling me here all along. The air that seeped from its mouth was colder than morning frost, carrying the smell of damp stone and rot. The crude wooden cross with the word "Leave" carved into it leaned slightly. One arm splintered, as though something had pushed against it from inside. I told myself I would never go in. I would wait outside until morning, find another way out. Anything but that. But when night fell, the voices grew unbearable. Louder than before, hundreds of them, a swelling chorus that surrounded the clearing until I thought my tent would collapse under the pressure of sound. And above them all, the woman's voice, closer now, clear and insistent. Come down. Sometime past midnight, I realized I was already standing at the entrance, barefoot, shivering, the tent far behind me. My body had moved without me deciding to. My hand trembled as I raised my headlamp, and the beam pierced only a few feet into the cavern before the blackness swallowed it. The rock walls seemed wet, slick with condensation that glittered like veins. I stepped inside. The cave's breath was steady and cold, like standing inside a living lung. The ground sloped gently down, gravel crunching under my bare feet. My light caught bones half buried in the dirt. Animal, maybe, but long, white, and scattered like teeth. Deeper in, carvings marked the walls. Crude figures gouged into stone, their bodies twisted, their mouths wide. Some had no faces at all. The whispers echoed louder the further I went. My name over and over spoken by every voice I had ever known. Every voice I could imagine, until I wanted to claw at my ears just to make them stop. The walls narrowed, forcing me to turn sideways, and the stone scraped my shoulders. Panic rose in my throat, but the pull of that central voice dragged me deeper. I don't know how far I went before the tunnel opened into a chamber. My light swept across the space and froze on something that made my knees buckle. There were tents here. 3 of them, rotted and collapsed, their nylon shredded by damp and time. Scattered beside them were backpacks, sleeping bags, a rusted lantern, and beyond them, arranged neatly along the far wall, were bones. Human bones, dozens of them. Skulls stacked like offerings, ribs splayed in careful patterns. And hanging from the wall above them, written in charcoal letters smeared wide, was a message. The ridge takes what stays. The whispering surged to a scream inside my head. I staggered backward, slipped, and nearly dropped my light. In the beam, movement flickered. For a moment, I thought one of the shadows detached itself from the wall. It rose taller than any man, its edges indistinct like smoke clinging to the shape of a body. And from where a face should have been, the woman's voice spoke. It didn't whisper this time. It howled my name. I bolted. The scramble back through the tunnel was a blur of rock tearing at my skin and lungs burning with cold air. The voices followed, overlapping, shrieking, urging me back. Hands, real or imagined, I don't know, brushed against my arms as if reaching to pull me down again. My headlamp flickered, threatening to die, and for one desperate moment, I thought I'd be trapped in the dark forever. But somehow I burst back into the night. The clearing outside looked wrong. The trees leaned too close, their trunks bending inward as if trying to seal the cave shut behind me. The trail was still gone, replaced by nothing but forest. But this time I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how long I sprinted, branches whipping my face, rocks gouging my bare feet before I saw light. Not the amber glow of Pine Hollow like in another story, not the lure of something uncanny. Real light. Headlights. I crashed out of the trees and collapsed onto a dirt road. A pickup truck screeched to a halt yards away, its driver jumping out, shouting something I couldn't understand. I must have looked half mad, bleeding, barefoot, gasping for air. But I was alive. When I looked back, the tree line was just forest again. Silent. Still. No cave in sight. The man who found me drove me straight into town, asking questions I couldn't answer. I told him I'd been lost on the ridge, and his face hardened. "You're lucky you came down," he muttered. "Not everyone does." He wouldn't say more. It took days before the ringing in my head faded, and even longer before I stopped hearing the occasional whisper in the quiet. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is still, I swear I hear her voice again, sweet and patient, calling from just beyond the walls of my house. They say the Appalachians are older than bones, older than memory. Maybe some parts of them were never meant for us to walk. Black Elk Ridge doesn't want visitors. It doesn't want hikers or campers or anyone thinking they can tame it with tents and trail markers. It wants to be left alone. And if you ever hear your name carried on the wind from somewhere in those mountains, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. Because once the ridge knows you've heard it, it won't stop calling. The mountains have plenty of stories, but the ones people tell about Laurel Fork always sounded different. I first heard them as a kid, whispered at bonfires, or scrawled across cheap paperbacks you'd buy at gas stations. Some claimed an old trapper went mad there and butchered his family. Others said the land was cursed long before that, a burial ground where the earth was never meant to be disturbed. The one detail that stayed the same, no matter who told it, was the cabin. They called it the Red Cabin, though no one agreed on why. Some swore it was painted red, others that the wood itself bled through the boards, and a few whispered that it earned its name from what had happened inside. Whatever the truth, the advice was always simple. Don't stay there after dark. Like most warnings, it sank to the bottom of my mind until life left me desperate enough to ignore it. The summer of 2017 was the lowest point I'd had in years. I'd just gone through a breakup that felt like it gutted me, and the city where I lived seemed unbearable, a cage filled with noise and light. When a coworker mentioned a cheap place to rent for a week, tucked deep in the Appalachians where Laurel Fork runs cold through the hollows, I jumped on it. He said it was rustic, no cell service, cash only, but peaceful. I didn't realize until later that he never actually said the word cabin. He just said, a place. The drive-in took most of a day. The road narrowed from 2 lanes to gravel, then from gravel to rutted dirt, hemmed in by trees that seemed to lean closer the further I went. Laurel Fork itself ran parallel to the road for miles, a ribbon of dark water flashing through the trunks, and the air smelled faintly of iron. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low, bleeding red through the canopy. There it was. The cabin squatted at the edge of the clearing, its timbers dark with age. The color wasn't paint, but something deeper, like the wood had absorbed rust or blood long ago and never let it go. The roof sagged, the porch slanted, but the windows were unbroken, and the door hung straight. Someone had kept it alive, just enough to be used. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise the world usually carries. Inside, the cabin was spare. 1 room with a stone fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs, a bed frame with a thin mattress. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the smell was a mix of mildew and something sharper I couldn't place. A single lantern sat on the table, its glass smudged. I unpacked my bag, tried to shake off the unease crawling up my spine, and told myself this was what I'd wanted: solitude. The first night wasn't peaceful. It started with scratching, faint, almost imagined somewhere behind the walls. I sat up in bed, lantern low, listening to the sound of tiny claws or nails dragging against wood. Mice, I told myself. Just mice. But the longer it went, the less it sounded like scurrying, and the more it sounded like writing. Slow, deliberate strokes across the inside of the boards. I forced myself to lie back down, pulled the blanket over my head, and eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. In the morning, I checked the walls. The wood was scarred with lines I didn't remember seeing before. Not random scratches, straight gouges, as though something had been marking tallies in the night. There were 5 of them. I should have left then, but stubbornness has a way of turning fear into challenge. I told myself I was being ridiculous, grabbed my fishing rod, and spent the day down by the creek. The water was cold, running fast over slick stones, and for a few hours I managed to lose myself in its rhythm. I even caught a few trout, though I had no appetite when I brought them back. The cabin loomed over me as I gutted the fish, the red timbers soaking up the light like a sponge. That night, the scratching came again, louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the wall and nearly gagged. It wasn't claws at all. It was a whisper, dragging itself along the grain of the wood, shaping words too low to make out. My skin prickled. I stumbled back from the wall and nearly toppled the lantern. The flame jumped, shadows clawed across the beams, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the corner. By dawn, another set of marks had been carved into the boards. 5 more, perfectly aligned beneath the first. 10 now. I left the cabin that morning and walked into town, or what passed for town. A gas station, a diner, a post office no bigger than a trailer. The woman at the diner counter gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes when I asked about Laurel Fork. When I mentioned the cabin, the smile vanished. She leaned close and lowered her voice. "You're staying there?" I nodded, suddenly ashamed, though I didn't know why. "People don't rent that place," she said. "They survive it. If you're smart, you'll pack up and go before the count finishes. "What count?" I asked, but she only shook her head and walked away. I drove back with my stomach in knots, convincing myself she was just trying to scare me. But when I opened the door, the smell hit me again, stronger now, a metallic tang under the mildew, like old blood baked into the boards. And the tallies had multiplied. 15 of them now, perfect, straight, carved clean. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the table with the lantern burning, eyes fixed on the walls. Around midnight, the whispering began again, threading through the wood like smoke. This time I heard it clearly. A woman's voice, soft, patient, counting. 1. Silence. 2. The room seemed to grow smaller with each number, the walls pressing closer, the marks etching deeper. By the time she reached 5, I was shaking, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. When she reached 10, the lantern sputtered. By 15, I was sobbing into my hands, begging for it to stop. Then she whispered 16, and a fresh mark carved itself into the wood, right before my eyes. I stumbled outside into the night air, gasping, clutching the lantern. The forest was utterly still, every tree black against the sky. And there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw her, a figure standing among the pines, draped in what looked like a dress that swayed though there was no wind. Her face was hidden in shadow, but I knew the voice was hers. She lifted one arm, slow and deliberate, and pointed back toward the cabin. My legs gave out. I woke hours later, sprawled in the dirt, the lantern cold beside me. The cabin door stood wide open, though I knew I'd slammed it shut when I ran. Inside, the tally marks had grown again, 20 now. I tried to leave that morning. I packed my bag, shoved it into the car, and turned the key. The engine coughed once and died. I tried again. Nothing. The third time, the radio blared to life instead of the ignition. A woman's voice whispered through the static, counting, starting exactly where she'd left off. 21. 22. The sound poured through the speakers, though I hadn't even turned them on. I ripped the keys from the ignition, but the counting went on, louder, clearer. When I staggered back into the cabin, the marks had grown again, 25. That was the moment I realized I wasn't going anywhere. The cabin wasn't just keeping count, it was keeping me, and the voice wasn't going to stop until the tally reached something I didn't want to imagine. The whispering didn't stop, even after I smashed the radio. Even after I hurled the lantern across the room and watched it gutter out, the voice carried on. Counting. Each number sank into the boards, searing a new mark into the wall as though invisible hands carved it from the inside. 26, 27, 28. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the sound burrowed through bone, into my skull, echoing until my thoughts were no longer my own. At sunrise, the tally stood at 30. I staggered into the clearing, dragging my pack with me, and tried the car again. This time, it started, but when I shoved it into gear, the tires spun uselessly. The gravel had given way beneath them. The earth swallowed half the wheels. I hadn't seen it sink in the night, but the car wasn't moving. I slammed the door and screamed into the trees until my voice broke. The forest gave me nothing back. By noon, I was pacing the porch like an animal, debating whether to abandon everything and run down the road. But when I tried, I realized the dirt track out of the clearing no longer looked the same. It stretched straighter than I remembered, narrowing into a tunnel of trees that leaned so close the sky itself seemed to vanish. I took 5 steps before. The counting grew louder, pressing against me from every direction. 31. 32. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and I stumbled back to the cabin, gasping like I'd been underwater. The marks on the wall waited. 33 now. The second night was worse. I'd kept the lantern burning low, terrified of the dark corners, but even the light didn't help. The counting started almost immediately, patient, steady. The same woman's voice curling through the wood. At first it was slow, deliberate, each number drawn out like a knife dragged against stone. But as the night deepened, the rhythm quickened, and the sound began to multiply. Dozens of voices joined her, overlapping, speaking in unison like a congregation. My name threaded through them, woven into the numbers until I couldn't tell one from the other. I thought about the stories I'd heard as a kid, the trapper who went mad, the families who never left. I wondered how high their tallies had gone before the cabin decided it was finished. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I staggered to the wall, screaming at the marks, demanding to know what they meant. My fist slammed against the wood. The boards rattled, then split. A piece of paneling cracked loose and fell to the floor. Behind it, in the hollow space, I saw something glimmer. Not wood, not insulation. Teeth. Dozens of human teeth wedged into the gaps between the beams, pressed tight together like seeds. Some were yellow, some gray with rot, a few with roots still attached. The smell that rolled out was sharp and sour, the same metallic tang I'd been tasting since the first night. I stumbled back, bile burning my throat. When I blinked, the teeth were gone, the wall whole again. But the marks had grown. 40 now. I don't remember collapsing onto the mattress, but I remember waking with sunlight stabbing through the window. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I turned my head and saw the wall. 50. That day broke something in me. I stopped pretending I could leave. I stopped pretending the car or the road or the trees offered any way out. The cabin had me. All I could do was wait and hope the count didn't reach whatever end it was racing toward. The third night bled into chaos. The voices didn't wait for dark. They began as the sun set, rising in volume until the walls themselves shook with the sound. The counting raced faster, so fast I couldn't keep up. I pressed myself into the corner, rocking, whispering prayers I hadn't believed in years. Shadows pooled in the corners, shapes that didn't belong to furniture or firelight. They stretched long fingers across the floor, reaching. Sometime past midnight, the woman stepped into the room. She didn't come through the door. She seeped from the wall, sliding between the boards like smoke, until she stood at the foot of the bed. Her dress hung in tatters, edges fluttering though the air was still. Her hair clung to her face, hiding her features, but her mouth was visible, wide, red, smiling. The counting stopped. For the first time, she spoke something else. Almost finished. Then she raised one pale hand and pointed to the tallies. 70. My chest clenched. Finished at what? At 100? At some other number carved into the bones of the cabin? I wanted to ask, but my tongue wouldn't move. My throat had locked like stone. She took a step closer, and the boards beneath her groaned like they were straining under her weight. Another step, and I could smell her, wet earth, rot, and the copper sting of blood. I don't remember what happened next. My memory fractures into flashes, running into the trees barefoot, tripping over roots, the glow of the cabin receding behind me, branches clawing my arms, the sound of her voice, not whispering but screaming now, numbers tearing the night apart. 80, 81, 82, and then nothing. I woke on the side of a paved road with the sun high overhead. My body was scraped raw, my clothes shredded, but I was alive. A man in a passing truck stopped, helped me into the cab, and drove me straight into town. He asked where I'd come from, but when I said Laurel Fork, his face darkened. He muttered a prayer under his breath and didn't speak again until he dropped me at the diner. Inside, the waitress stared at me like I was a ghost. "You stayed," she said softly. Not a question, a statement. I asked her about the counting, about the marks, about the woman. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter how far you run," she said. "The cabin keeps its tally. It always knows the number." I didn't understand then. Not fully. But I do now. Because the marks didn't stop when I left. At night, in my apartment miles away, I hear the whisper sometimes. Slow, patient, picking up where it left off. 83, 84, 85. And when I turn on the light, I find new scratches on the walls, carved into plaster instead of wood. The red cabin may still stand on Laurel Fork, waiting for the next soul desperate or foolish enough to enter, but I carry it with me now. The count has never ended, and when it finally does, I don't think I'll wake up on any road again. So if you ever find yourself in those mountains and someone offers you a place to stay for cheap, ask them what color the cabin is. If they say red, turn around. Don't go, because the cabin doesn't rent itself out. It collects. If you drive far enough into the Appalachian backroads, you'll find hollows where the trees hang so close, overhead the sky itself disappears. Places where the air grows damp and the ground never quite dries, where sunlight filters weak and gray even at noon. Burnt Church Hollow was one of those places. I never even heard the name until the fall of 2015, when I was working for a county mapping project that had me logging abandoned sites in remote stretches of Virginia. Most of my work was tedious, taking GPS readings, noting structural hazards, and snapping photos of collapsing barns or half-forgotten cemeteries. But Burnt Church was different. It wasn't on any of the county's maps. I only found it because an old man at a gas station pointed me toward it when I asked about ruins. He looked at me for a long time before speaking, his eyes pale and cloudy like river stones. Then he said, "If you're fool enough to go into that hollow, don't stay past sundown, and if you hear singing, don't follow it." I thought it was just superstition, the kind of mountain lore you hear in every town, but something about the weight in his voice made the hair rise on my arms. I should have listened. The road into Burnt Church Hollow wasn't really a road at all, just a narrowing track of dirt and stone. My truck jolted and bounced as I crept deeper between the trees, and GPS signal fading until the screen went blank. The forest closed in around me, the branches interlocking overhead so tightly that light fell only in narrow beams. The air smelled of wet leaves, iron, and smoke. After nearly an hour of creeping forward, the trees opened into a clearing. At its center stood the remains of a church. The structure was blackened and skeletal, beams jutting up like ribs against the sky. The roof was gone, the bell tower a charred stump. What struck me most was how the ground itself seemed scorched, the soil darker, as if fire had seeped into it long ago and never let go. I stepped out of the truck, and the air immediately felt heavier. Not silent exactly. The forest hummed with distant insects, but muffled, like sound itself was being dampened. I walked toward the ruins, notebook in hand, telling myself it was just another job site. But the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The church doors were still standing, though warped and blackened. Carved into the wood were symbols I didn't recognize. Circles intersected with jagged lines, some burned so deep they looked fresh. I pushed the doors open, and they creaked like dying things. Inside was ash and shadow. Blackened pews sagged in crooked rows, their ends melted into grotesque shapes. The altar had collapsed, but on it lay a single book. Its cover was charred, but when I brushed the ash away, I saw it was a hymnal. Most of the pages were burned, but a few remained intact. The words weren't like any hymns I knew. The verses spoke of harvests of flesh and blood tithed to the hollow. The margins were filled with handwritten notes in a jagged script, underlining passages, circling words like sacrifice and offering. I closed the book and felt my stomach turn. This wasn't a church anymore. If it ever had been, something else had claimed it. I left quickly, taking photos with shaking hands. The sooner I documented the place, the sooner I could leave. But as I walked back to the truck, I noticed something strange. Across the clearing, small stones had been stacked into cairns, dozens of them, each topped with bits of bone. Some looked like animal remains, others, I wasn't so sure. They were arranged in a wide circle around the church, like sentinels. That's when I heard it. Singing. Faint at first, drifting through the trees. a low rhythmic hum, like many voices moving in unison. My chest tightened. The old man's words rang in my head. If you hear singing, don't follow it. I should have left. I should have climbed into my truck, turned the wheel, and never looked back. But curiosity has undone better people than me. I stepped toward the sound. The singing grew clearer the deeper I went into the woods. Male and female voices together, rising and falling in eerie harmony. No words I could recognize, just syllables drawn long and low, echoing through the hollow. My flashlight beam swung wildly as I stumbled over roots, heart hammering. After a few hundred yards, I came to another clearing. At its center stood another structure, not ruins, but a cabin. Unlike the church, it hadn't burned. Its timbers were dark but solid, its roof intact. From inside, the singing swelled. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Through a crack in the wood, I peered inside. The cabin's single room was filled with people, at least 20 of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, their heads bowed. Each wore rough homespun clothes, dark and ragged, though I couldn't tell if they were costumes or something older. They swayed in unison as they sang, their voices threading together into something that sounded more like a drone than music. At the front of the room stood a figure cloaked in black, arms raised. On the floor before them lay a long wooden table. I couldn't see what was on it at first, not until one of the singers moved aside and the light shifted. It was a body, pale, still, stretched out across the wood. My stomach lurched. The hymn shifted, voices rising into something almost jubilant. The cloaked figure lowered their hands and picked up a blade that gleamed even in the dim light. I stumbled back from the wall, my breath ragged. A branch snapped beneath my boot, loud as a gunshot in the quiet. The singing stopped. All at once, every head inside turned toward the crack in the wall. 20 pairs of eyes staring directly where I stood. And then, in perfect unison, they whispered, "He's here." The moment those voices stopped singing and spoke as one, my blood went cold. 20 throats whispering, "He's here," in perfect unison. It didn't sound human. It sounded rehearsed, like they'd been waiting for me. I stumbled back from the cabin wall, heart pounding so hard I could hear the rush in my ears. The forest around me pressed close, every tree suddenly a barrier. The cabin door creaked open. No one stepped out at first, but the singing began again. Softer this time, slower. A single melody carried by one voice, and then another, and another, weaving into a hymn that seemed to pull at my ribs. My legs wanted to move forward even as my mind screamed to run. I turned and bolted into the trees. Branches clawed at my clothes, roots threatened to drag me down, but I ran until my lungs burned. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was gone. Just woods. Just darkness. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then the singing started again. It came from the trees ahead of me, low and droning, rising and falling like breath. My panic spiked. I veered left, crashing through undergrowth, only for the sound to shift with me. No matter which way I turned, the hymn stayed just ahead, drawing me deeper into the hollow. After what felt like hours, the forest opened into another clearing. At its center stood the church again. The same blackened ruins I'd left behind hours ago. My stomach flipped. I couldn't have circled back. I hadn't turned enough times for that. And yet, here it was, the scorched beams jutting up like ribs, the ground dark with ash. Lanterns burned around its perimeter now. Figures stood between the cairns I'd seen earlier, each cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden. Their chant rolled across the clearing, no longer hymn, but a guttural drone that vibrated in my chest. I froze at the tree line, but it didn't matter. They knew I was there. One by one, the hooded figures raised their arms and pointed at me. The leader stepped forward. The same cloaked figure I'd seen in the cabin, hands pale against the dark fabric. They raised their voice above the chant, and the words carved themselves into my memory. The harvest is found. The circle opened, and I was dragged forward without anyone touching me. My feet scraped the ground, my body lurching against my will. I fought, clawing at the dirt, but it was useless. The cult's voices rose, drowning me. They pulled me into the shell of the church. The pews were gone now. In their place stood a stone altar, blackened by fire, but unbroken. On it lay the same book I'd found earlier, open to a page that glowed faintly as though lit from beneath. The leader gestured to it, and the others began to hum a verse. The words weren't English, but the meaning burrowed straight into my skull. They were calling something. Not a god, not a spirit, something older. Something that didn't belong in words at all. The air grew heavier, pressing down until my knees buckled. The ground trembled. From beneath the altar came a sound like stone cracking. The earth split, and a hand clawed upward, long, pale, with fingers too many to count. Another followed. Then a shape began to rise, vast and formless, like smoke given weight. My vision blurred as the figure loomed higher, blotting out the ruined rafters. The cult dropped to their knees, arms raised, chanting louder, faster. I screamed, but my voice was nothing against theirs. The thing turned toward me, though it had no face, just a shifting mass of mouths that opened and closed in unison, whispering the same words I'd heard from the old man at the gas station. If you hear singing, don't follow it. Then it laughed, a sound like thousands of voices tearing through my mind at once. The leader stepped forward and seized my arm. Their grip was ice. They dragged me to the altar, pressed me down, and raised the blade. My body convulsed, every muscle screaming, but I couldn't move. I was locked in place as the chanting reached a fever pitch. At the last second, lightning split the sky. A storm I hadn't seen brewing tore open above the hollow. Rain hammered down, hissing as it struck the altar. The cult didn't stop. If anything, their voices grew more frenzied, desperate to finish, before the storm drowned them out. I don't know how I did it. Maybe the storm weakened whatever hold they had. Maybe the thing they were calling wasn't ready. But in that moment of chaos, I wrenched free. The blade cut deep across my arm as I fell, blood spattering the stone. The thing above the altar shuddered, its mouths opening wider, and the cult wailed in unison. I ran. I didn't look back. Not when the ground shook beneath me, not when the chanting turned to screams, not when the storm swallowed the hollow in darkness. I ran until my lungs burned and the trees thinned, until I collapsed on the road miles from my truck. When I staggered into town the next morning, soaked and bloody, the diner waitress took one look at me and whispered, "You heard them, didn't you?" I demanded answers, but she just shook her head. The church burned once. It should have stayed burned, but they kept the song alive, and now it won't die until it takes what it's owed. I left the county that day and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world outside my window is silent, I hear it. Faint. A low, rhythmic chant. It doesn't matter how far I've come. The hymn follows, and I know one day, when the storm breaks again, the harvest will be finished. Widow's Creek isn't marked on most maps, and maybe that's for the best. It runs narrow and black through a deep cut in the Appalachian hills, fed by veins of water that rise from the ground like open wounds. The holler around it is steep, overgrown, and eerily still. Even the locals don't like to talk about it. When I first asked for directions, the clerk at a bait shop spat into a cup and muttered, "Ain't nothing up there but ghosts and ash." When I pressed him, he leaned closer, his eyes sharp. "Some families don't know when to quit, son. You leave that place be." But I didn't. In the fall of 2014, I was documenting abandoned homesteads for a photography project. My focus was the hidden Appalachia, Old houses reclaimed by vines, mills rotting beside creeks, barns sagging under their own weight. A professor had told me Widow's Creek was lined with the skeletons of settlements that never made it through the Depression. If you want raw decay, he said, that's where you'll find it. The drive-in was longer than I expected. The paved road dwindled to gravel, the gravel to dirt, the dirt to nothing but ruts carved through clay. Trees grew closer and closer until their branches meshed overhead, dimming the daylight. It was early afternoon when I parked my car at a washed-out bend and set off on foot, camera slung around my neck. At first, it was beautiful in its way. Ferns crawling over stone, mushrooms bursting from fallen logs, shafts of light spilling down in narrow beams. But the deeper I went, the less natural it felt. The air thickened, heavy with a burnt tang, as if somewhere far off a fire still smoldered. And scattered through the undergrowth, I started finding things. The first was a shoe. Small, a child's. The leather cracked, the sole worn nearly smooth, but the laces were tied in a careful bow. A few hundred yards later, I found a doll. Or what had been a doll once. Its face was gone, burned away, leaving only a blackened stump of cloth and straw. I told myself they were remnants of old homesteads, washed down the creek after floods, but something about how fresh they looked, how deliberately placed they seemed, made me uneasy. When I reached the first cabin, my stomach turned. It leaned crooked in a clearing, its roof half collapsed, its chimney cracked. But someone had been there recently. Smoke stains blackened the hearth inside. A pile of bones lay neatly in the corner, picked clean and stacked like kindling. Animal, I told myself quickly. Deer, rabbit, maybe hog. But the skull on top was wrong. Too round, too human. I stumbled back out, breath sharp, and almost tripped over the line strung across the doorway. Rope twisted from hair, dozens of teeth tied into it like beads. That was when I realized this wasn't decay. It wasn't abandoned at all. The deeper I followed Widow's Creek, the more cabins I found. Each one in ruin, but each showing signs of use. Ash in the fireplaces. Tattered blankets spread over sagging frames. Walls hung with charms made of bone and sinew, carved into crude shapes. And always the smell, smoke and iron, faint but unshakable. I should have turned back, but the light was already thinning, and I thought I was close to the heart of the hollow. My professor's words echoed in my head, raw decay. If I left now, all I'd have was half a reel of photos, and the creeping sense I'd missed something important. So I pressed on. The sun was setting when I heard it. Low rhythmic thumps echoing through the trees. Not voices, not chanting, just the steady pound of something heavy striking wood. I crept toward the sound, hard hammering, and soon saw another clearing. This one was different. At its center stood a cabin larger than the rest, its timbers blackened but intact, its windows boarded. Around it, dozens of totems jutted from the ground, wooden poles draped with rags crowned with skulls. Some were animals, some weren't. Beneath each totem, ash was piled in neat circles, like the ground had been burned on purpose. The pounding came from inside. A rhythm, slow and steady, shaking the boards. I raised my camera, zoomed in, and froze. Through a gap in the boards, I saw movement. A figure hunched low, shoulders massive, arms swinging in measured arcs. The sound was an axe striking wood. But it wasn't chopping logs. It was carving. Even from a distance, I could see the pale curve of what it worked on. Bone, long, human. I lowered the camera, bile rising in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but before I could, something shifted behind me. A twig snapped. I spun. Standing at the tree line were 3 children. At least, they looked like children at first glance. Thin, small, barefoot. Their clothes were rags, their skin pale as ash. Their eyes were wrong, cloudy, milky, like cataracts in the very young. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared at me with blank, unblinking faces. My knees went weak. I whispered a hello, though my voice cracked. They didn't answer. One of them tilted its head, slow and stiff, as if the muscles didn't quite know how to work. And then, in unison, they turned and slipped back into the trees. I don't remember deciding to follow, but my feet carried me after them. Branches clawed my arms, roots caught my boots, but I kept the pale shapes in sight until they slipped into another clearing. This one was worse than the last. At its center stood a cabin larger than any I'd seen yet. Its roof sagged but held, its walls patched with mismatched boards. Smoke trickled from a crooked chimney, carrying that same iron scent. The children vanished through the door, which hung open just enough for me to see inside. The first thing I noticed was the light, orange and flickering, from dozens of lanterns strung along the beams. The second was the smell. Stronger now, thick, metallic, clinging to my tongue. The third was the table. It stretched nearly the length of the cabin, covered in plates, bowls, and knives, and around it sat figures, dozens of them, men and women, gray-skinned, gaunt, their hair stringy and sparse. Their eyes were as cloudy as the children's, their jaws working slowly, steadily, as they chewed. No one spoke, no one looked up. The only sound was the scrape of knives and the soft, wet noise of eating. On the table, piled high, was meat. Some of it was animal. Most of it wasn't. I staggered back, my boot crunching on a branch. The sound cracked through the clearing like thunder. For the first time, every head in the cabin lifted in unison. Dozens of cloudy eyes fixed on me. The moment those cloudy eyes locked on me, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Dozens of them rose from the widow family's table in eerie unison, their chairs scraping like bones dragged across stone. The silence was unbearable. Not one spoke, not one shouted. Just the sound of bare feet shuffling against warped wood. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, but they didn't chase. They emerged slowly, patiently, as though they already knew I had nowhere to go. Men, women, children, all gaunt and gray-skinned, with cataract eyes that stared right through me. I turned and bolted into the woods, lungs burning. Branches tore my face, briars ripped at my jeans, but I ran until my vision blurred. When I dared to look back, I saw nothing. No one followed. My chest eased for half a second, until I tripped into a snare. The rope yanked me off my feet and slammed me sideways into the dirt. My head cracked against a rock, stars exploding across my vision. Before I could move, hands gripped me, small, thin hands, too many at once. Pale faces loomed above me. The same cloudy-eyed children I'd seen before, their blank expressions as unmoving as masks. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They simply bound my wrists with rope that smelled faintly of hair and dragged me across the forest floor. I kicked, thrashed, screamed for help, but my voice died in the trees. No echo carried it. It was as if the hollow itself swallowed every sound. They pulled me back to the cabin. Inside, the family had cleared the table, their lanterns burning brighter than before. The man at the head, broad-shouldered, hair white as ash, watched with cloudy eyes that never blinked. They threw me to the floor before him. For a long moment, he just studied me. His jaw worked slow, chewing on nothing, as if the motion had become instinct. Then his voice rasped out like dry leaves. Fire took us. The family echoed the words, not shouted, not whispered, but muttered in low harmony, as if repeating a prayer. The next days blurred. I don't know how many there were. They didn't keep time like normal people. I woke and slept in cycles of dim light and lamplight, never certain what hour it was. They kept me tied in a corner, ropes biting my wrists and ankles. Sometimes one of the cloudy-eyed children brought me water in a chipped cup. Sometimes they brought food, meat gray and stringy, served on a cracked plate. I didn't eat it. Hunger gnawed, but revulsion kept me stronger than appetite. I watched them. That was the worst part, seeing how they lived. Their routines were grotesque reflections of family life. At dawn, they gathered around the table, bowing their heads before eating. No prayers, no words, just silence. Their jaws worked steadily, knives scraping plates, but never conversation. In the evenings, they prepared food again, smoke rising from the chimney in thick, dark columns that stank of iron and grease. The children played in the dirt outside, but their games were wrong. They built little dolls from twigs and scraps of bone, dressing them in rags. Sometimes they lined them up and set them aflame, clapping their hands in rhythm with the crackle. One night, I saw the truth of what they ate. A woman brought in a sack dragged across the ground, dark stains soaking through the fabric. She upended it onto the table, and a man's body spilled out. Broken. Fresh. His eyes wide and glassy. The family didn't react with horror. They simply set upon the task, skinning, cutting, dividing. Children carried bowls to the fire. Adults sharpened knives, all in silence. I couldn't stop shaking. My ropes rubbed my wrists raw, blood slickening the knots. But no matter how I fought, I couldn't get free. On the third night, if it was the third, the white-haired man came to me. He crouched low, his cloudy eyes inches from mine, the smell of ash clinging to his breath. His voice rasped like fire dying in a pit. "Fire took us," he said again. Then he pressed one hand to my chest, his palm ice cold. "We feed the fire." The family murmured the words in unison. My heart slammed against my ribs. That night, they moved me. They dragged me outside, across the clearing, toward the pit I'd stumbled into before. The air grew hotter as we neared, though no flame burned. Ash rose in faint spirals from the ground, glowing embers buried deep beneath. They bound me to a post beside it, rope digging into my arms, smoke filling my lungs until I coughed black. Around me, the family gathered in a circle. Each held a bundle, sticks, rags, bones. They piled them at the edge of the pit, then struck sparks with flint. The fire caught slow, crawling up the offerings, smoke rising thick and acrid. And then they began to hum. Not words, not whispers, just low guttural hums that vibrated through the clearing, dozens of voices blending into one. The ground beneath me trembled. The pit glowed faintly red, as if something deep below shifted in its sleep. I closed my eyes, tears streaking my face. I thought of my mother, of friends back home, of everything mundane and safe I'd never see again. I thought I was about to die. But they didn't burn me that night. Instead, the hum ended abruptly. The family turned and filed back into the cabin, leaving me bound in smoke and silence. I sagged against the ropes, coughing, my lungs raw. I realized then they weren't rushing. They were waiting, feeding the fire in cycles, preparing me. The next day, if it was day, a girl crept toward me while the others worked inside. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, her hair stringy, her eyes just as cloudy. She carried something in her hands, held out carefully. It was a toy. A doll made of twigs, dressed in scraps of denim, its head wrapped in cloth. She set it at my feet, then crouched and stared. For a moment something flickered in her expression, something almost human. But then her jaw began to move, slow and steady, chewing on nothing. She rose and walked away. The doll remained. By the time they dragged me back inside, my wrists were bleeding from struggling. They tied me to a chair at the table this time. Before me sat a plate of meat. Steam rose from it, carrying that sickly sweet metallic scent. The white-haired man sat across, his cloudy eyes never leaving me. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the plate closer. "Eat," he rasped. I gagged, shaking my head. He pushed it closer. Eat. When I refused again, one of the women seized my jaw and forced my mouth open. They shoved the meat past my teeth. My stomach heaved, bile rising, but her hand clamped my nose until instinct forced me to swallow. The room erupted in hums of approval. That was when I broke, not physically. I still wanted to live. But something inside me snapped, because I realized they weren't just feeding me to keep me alive. They were making me one of them. Slowly, piece by piece, I was becoming part of the fire cycle. That night, tied once more in the corner, I saw movement in the rafters. Not the family. Not the children. Shadows. Shapes curled in the beams, writhing like smoke. I blinked hard, convinced it was madness. But when I looked again, they were still there, watching. The following morning, or what passed for it, they prepared again. This time, I knew. The table was cleared. Bundles of sticks and rags gathered. The pit outside glowed faintly even before they lit the offerings. The family murmured low, jaws working, cloudy eyes glistening. They tied me to the post once more. Smoke billowed as flames licked upward. The hum began again, vibrating through my ribs. The pit trembled. Ash swirled. The air grew hotter, pressing down until my skin felt ready to blister. The white-haired man stepped forward with a torch. He lifted it high, then lowered it toward the bundles at my feet. I screamed until my throat tore. The howl saved me. It ripped through the hollow, deeper and louder than before, shaking the ground. The family froze, their heads snapping toward the trees. The torch faltered. The man's cloudy eyes widened for the first time. The howl came again, closer, rolling like thunder. The forest trembled. Lanterns shattered inside the cabin. The family broke their silence at last, not with words but with shrieks, high and keening, a chorus of fear. In the chaos, the ropes at my wrists loosened. I don't know how. Maybe the fire's heat weakened them. Maybe something older intervened. I yanked free, kicked the smoldering bundles aside, and bolted. The forest erupted behind me, screams, crashing wood, the howl reverberating. I didn't look back. My legs tore through undergrowth, lungs ripping with every breath. When I stumbled onto the road hours later, dawn was breaking. I collapsed beside my car, shaking so hard I couldn't fit the key into the ignition. Somehow it started. Somehow I drove. I never returned. But sometimes, at night, I smell it again. Smoke, iron, and ash curling beneath my door. I hear the scrape of chairs against wood, the steady chew of jaws. And I remember the doll the girl left me, twigs, wrapped in denim, a cloth head. I didn't bring it back, but one morning, weeks later, it appeared in my apartment, sitting at the foot of my bed. The smell of ash filled the room. If you grow up in the Appalachians, you hear stories about hollows that don't want you, places that twist your compass, steal your sense of time, and leave you wandering until the forest decides what to do with you. Most of those stories sound like warnings to keep kids from getting lost, but some of them carry a weight in the telling, a silence that clings after the words are gone. That was the feeling I got when an old surveyor told me about Coldwater Hollow. He leaned across the table in a diner off Route 19, tapped his cigarette against the formica, and said, "Don't go down there at night. The sky don't belong to us in that place." I laughed, but he didn't. In 2016, I was working freelance for an outdoor magazine, chasing stories of forgotten trails and ghost towns. The editor sent me a map marked with old survey routes, asking if I could document what was left of them. Coldwater Hollow was on that list. When I saw the name, I thought of the old man at the diner and felt a shiver I didn't admit to anyone. But the assignment was money, and I couldn't afford to turn it down. The road in was little more than a logging track, washed out in places, overgrown in others. I parked my truck where the trees pressed too close and set out on foot, camera, and notebook in my pack. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low through the canopy. The air smelled of pine and damp stone, the creek gurgling faintly somewhere ahead. For a while, it was beautiful, quiet, green, untouched. But as the trail dipped deeper, the light dimmed in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't just shade. It was as if the air itself had thickened, swallowing the sun. I checked my watch. 4:30. By the dimness, it should have been near dusk. I walked faster, unease crawling up my spine. The first sign something was wrong came from the birds, or rather their absence. One moment the forest buzzed with sparrows and jays, and the next it went silent. Utterly, impossibly silent. My own footsteps sounded muffled, like I was moving through heavy cloth. I stopped and held my breath, straining to hear anything. Wind, insects, the creek. But there was nothing. Then the smell hit me. Not rot. Not smoke. Something metallic, sharp, like blood spilled on stone. It clung to the back of my throat, made me swallow hard. I pressed on, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. An hour later, I came across the first structure. It looked like a barn from a distance, slumped and sagging, its roof half-caved. But, as I approached, something about the geometry didn't sit right. The angles seemed off, too sharp in places, too long in others. When I walked around it, the sides didn't line up. One wall stretched farther than the others, tapering to a point that shouldn't have existed. My eyes watered trying to follow the lines, and I stumbled back, dizzy. Through a gap in the boards, I caught a glimpse inside. The floor wasn't level. It dipped away at impossible angles, as though the ground itself had tilted beneath it. Lying in the middle of that warped space was a deer, or what had once been a deer. Its body was stretched. Not torn, not mangled. Stretched, as though someone had gripped its head and hooves and pulled until the bones thinned like taffy. Its eyes bulged from its skull, its legs tapering into unnatural points. No blood, no wounds, just pulled wrong. I staggered back into the clearing, bile burning my throat. My camera hung heavy at my side, but I couldn't bring myself to lift it. Some things don't want to be documented. By the time I found the creek, the sky above had dimmed to near night, though my watch insisted it was barely 6. I looked up, hoping for stars, and froze. The sky was wrong. The stars weren't where they should be. Constellations I'd known since childhood were jumbled, rearranged. Orion's belt stretched into a crooked line. The Big Dipper bent into a shape I didn't recognize. And as I stared, the stars moved. Slowly, subtly, shifting into new patterns like beads sliding on invisible strings. My chest tightened. The old surveyor's words echoed back. The sky don't belong to us in that place. I turned to leave, heart hammering, but the trail behind me was gone. Not overgrown, not hidden. Gone. Where I expected the rutted track, there was only forest, thick and unbroken. I spun a circle, panic rising. No road, no trail, just trees pressing close on every side. I told myself I'd gotten turned around, that I just needed to backtrack. I walked for 20 minutes following the creek, but the banks twisted in ways that made no sense. Once, I found myself staring at my own footprints pressed fresh into the mud. That night, I tried to camp. I set my tent on a patch of level ground, lit a small fire, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars rearrange themselves overhead. They formed patterns I couldn't name, circles within circles, jagged lines that bent and broke, spirals that tightened until they vanished. The fire sputtered, struggling for air, though no wind blew. When it died, the darkness was total. Somewhere in that blackness, the creek stopped. Not trickled or froze. Stopped. One moment, water gurgled over stone. The next, it was silence. I didn't sleep. At dawn, if it was dawn, because the light that seeped through the trees was sickly gray, I packed my things and tried again to find my way out. I walked for hours, though my watch ticked only minutes. Time bent like the trees, refusing to flow straight. My stomach growled, my legs ached, but I couldn't tell if I'd been moving for a day or 10. That was when I saw the second barn. It was identical to the first. Same sagging roof, same warped walls. My pulse spiked as I realized what that meant. I hadn't stumbled onto another ruin. I'd walked in a circle. Only, it wasn't exactly the same. This one had doors hanging open wide enough to see inside. The warped floor was there, dipping away at wrong angles. But instead of a deer, the space was filled with objects. Dozens of them. Shoes, all sizes. Men's boots, women's heels, children's sneakers, lined neatly in rows across the twisted boards. Some looked decades old, leather cracked and curling. Others were modern, bright, scuffed from recent wear. I counted at least 100 pairs. Beside them lay backpacks, jackets, tools, belongings of people who had come here before me. My breath caught. I stepped back, nearly tripping over a stone, and when I looked up, the sky shifted again. The stars bent into a shape I almost recognized. A circle, a mouth, and in that moment, I realized the hollow wasn't just trapping me. It was feeding. I don't remember running from that second barn. I remember the shoes, the neat rows of them, the way the sky bent above me into a jagged spiral. But after that, my memory froze. One moment, I was staring at the impossible geometry. The next, I was stumbling through the forest with blood on my palms, as though I'd clawed my way across stone. When I came to, the sky was darker than before. My watch said 10 a.m., but the stars had already returned, wheeling and twisting into new arrangements. My fire kit was gone. My pack, too. Only the camera still hung around my neck, though the screen flickered uselessly whenever I tried to switch it on. I walked. For how long, I don't know. The hollow bent time into knots. Sometimes my breath frosted in front of me as though it were winter. Other times sweat poured down my back in suffocating heat. The trees shifted with the seasons, bare one moment, green the next, as though years were passing in heartbeats. My footsteps left tracks in snow that melted before my eyes. At one point, I stumbled into a clearing filled with cabins, dozens of them, each one sagging, half-rotted, but all in neat rows like a town square. I thought I'd found Coldwater itself, the lost settlement. Relief surged through me until I noticed the doors. They were open, every one of them. Inside, the cabins weren't rooms. They were doorways into nothing. Pure blackness stretched beyond their thresholds, a darkness thicker than night. I threw a rock into one, and it never landed. No sound, no echo, just gone. I backed away, heart thudding, and nearly tripped over something in the dirt. A body. No, not a body. A figure carved from wood, stretched and bent into a man's shape, its face gouged smooth. Dozens more lay scattered around the clearing, twisted into grotesque postures. For a terrible second, I thought they were people, transformed, but the grain of the wood gave them away. Even so, their presence made my skin crawl. The stars shifted again, and the sky itself bent lower. Not the clouds. There were none. The sky. It sagged, pressing down like a ceiling too close overhead. The constellations writhed, twisting into a shape I couldn't name, a jagged curve that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. I ran. The trail, if it ever was a trail, looped back on itself. I passed the same creek 3 times, though each time it looked different. Once frozen solid, once running red with silt, once bone dry with dead fish lying scattered in the bed. My mind frayed at the edges, unable to reconcile what I saw with what I knew of the world. Night fell again, though my watch insisted it was still morning. I collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving, and for the first time since entering the hollow, I slept. When I woke, I wasn't where I'd fallen. I was inside one of the barns, The warped walls leaned inward, the floor dipping away, and in the center lay not a deer, not belongings, but people. Dozens of them, stretched thin like the first animal I'd seen. Their bodies elongated, bones warped into spindly arcs, mouths gaping open as though they'd been caught mid-scream. Their eyes were gone, sockets caved inward, the floor tilted beneath them, sloping into an impossible angle that vanished into the ground. As I stared, their bodies shifted, slowly, like something was pulling them downward, stretching them thinner still. The geometry wasn't holding them. It was consuming them. My scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, slammed into a wall, and the boards gave way. I fell out into the forest, landing hard in the mud. The barn was gone. Only trees surrounded me. That was the moment I realized the hollow wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was alive. And I was inside it. The next hours, or days, blurred. Time folded in on itself. Once, I saw myself walking ahead on the trail, 50 yards away, my own pack slung across my shoulders. I shouted, but the figure never turned. It just walked on, vanishing into the trees. Another time I heard laughter, my own echoing through the forest. I stopped eating, stopped drinking. My body screamed for water, but every creek ran wrong. The liquid thick and dark, reflecting stars that didn't exist. My lips cracked, my throat bled, but I couldn't bring myself to drink. And then I found the pit. It wasn't wide, maybe 30 feet across, but it dropped into darkness that made my stomach twist. Around its edge lay dozens of belongings, boots, cameras, watches, tents, all piled in careful rows. I saw my own pack among them, my fire kit, my notebook. Even though I hadn't left them there, I peered over the edge. The darkness below wasn't empty. It moved. Stars. Thousands of them, spinning in spirals, rearranging themselves in patterns that pulsed with terrible rhythm. It wasn't the sky above. It was the sky beneath, reflected back from some impossible distance. I staggered, bile rising. The hollow wasn't just bending space. It was folding the sky into itself, eating it piece by piece. A sound rose from the pit. Not words, not whispers. A low vibration that shook the earth, rattled my teeth. My vision blurred. My bones felt like they might splinter. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my skull, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the stars below. Vast, inhuman, leering upward. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was on my knees, screaming into the pit. The next, I was stumbling onto a gravel road under a sky that looked almost normal. My truck sat where I'd left it days, or weeks, before. Its windshield was frosted with dew, its tires half sunken into the mud. I drove until the mountains faded behind me, but the sky never looked right again. At first it was subtle. A star in the wrong place, a constellation bent out of shape. Friends told me I was imagining it, that light pollution played tricks, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it became. The patterns I'd seen in the hollow, the spirals, the jagged lines, the mouth, crept slowly into the heavens above my own home. Sometimes at night I wake and find the stars rearranging themselves outside my window, slowly, deliberately, like the hollow is still watching, like it never let me go. Ashwood Hill isn't a place you'll find on maps, not anymore. The road up there has been swallowed by vines and rains, and the people who live in Claiborne, Virginia, would just as soon let it stay buried. Folks will talk about most things in the mountains, about bears breaking into sheds, about copperheads sunning themselves on warm rocks, even about the haints said to wander back roads at night. But Ashwood Hill is different. When the name slips out in conversation, it's usually followed by silence, the kind that makes you realize you've stepped across some invisible line. I first heard about it while working on a project documenting Appalachian graveyards. My interest wasn't in the polished, cared-for cemeteries with their granite stones and plastic flowers, but in the forgotten places, the little family plots tucked behind barns, the churchyards where names had faded, the mountainside clearings where grief outlasted the families who'd planted it. You can learn a lot about a people by how they bury their dead, and Appalachia, with its long history of poverty, mining disasters, and tight-knit kinship, seemed a place where grief had written itself deep into the soil. In Claiborne's diner, over chipped mugs of coffee, I mentioned that I was looking for unique cemeteries. The man at the counter, white-haired, his face carved with lines of work and smoke, shifted uneasily. "Don't go asking about Ashwood Hill," he muttered. "Ain't nothing up there but grief best left buried." The waitress gave me a sharper warning. She leaned close, her voice dropping, until I could barely hear it over the hiss of the fryer. "Don't go digging up old grief, son," she whispered. "It'll dig back." The phrasing lodged in my skull like a splinter. For days I tried to ignore it. There were other cemeteries to document, plenty of family plots with weathered crosses and sunken earth. But the silence around Ashwood Hill grew heavier the longer I stayed. Locals gave half glances toward the ridge when the evening fog rolled down. Someone said the mine disaster of 1904 had left more than 100 men unburied, the collapse swallowing them whole. Someone else mentioned the cemetery up top, where widows set stones for bodies that never returned. Nobody said much more than that. Nobody needed to. The quiet was louder than words. Finally, curiosity broke me. One gray October morning, I drove my truck as far as the washed-out road would allow. The path to the hill was barred by a rusted gate, sagging with barbed wire, the metal orange with decades of rain. I parked, grabbed my pack, and started the climb. The air shifted as soon as I stepped past the gate. I don't know how else to describe it except to say it felt heavy. Not just humid, though the damp clung to my clothes, but oppressive, like carrying another body on my back besides my pack. The trail wound steep between oaks and maples, their branches knitted overhead into a canopy that let through only thin shafts of gray light. My boots slipped on wet leaves. My breath came shallow. People in these mountains talk about mountain stretching, the way a climb can seem longer than it should be, the ridge retreating every time you think you're close. Ashwood Hill stretched. My thighs burned, my lungs ached, but the top never seemed nearer. By the time I crested the ridge, I felt wrung out, like I'd walked twice the distance. The cemetery lay in a clearing, fenced by sagging iron, whose bars bowed outward, as if the earth inside had pressed against them. Dozens of headstones jutted from the ground, some cracked and tilted, others standing too sharp, too clean. A few leaned so far they looked ready to fall. The grass between them grew patchy, clumped in some places, bare in others, the soil raw and exposed. The silence was immediate. No wind rattled the branches. No birds flitted overhead. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the ground itself swallowed sound. My ears rang with it. I pulled my notebook from my pack, more for something to do with my hands than any sense of professionalism, and began walking rows. The oldest stones dated back to the 1830s. Small markers, barely knee-high, many for children. Tiny headstones with lambs carved in relief, names worn nearly away. Sarah, 1841. Jacob, 1839. My chest tightened reading them. Half the graves seemed to belong to children who never saw their second birthday. I imagined winters without medicine, mothers cradling fever-hot infants while snow pressed against cabin walls. Farther in stood taller stones for miners, rows of them, clustered around the year 1904. That was when the mine collapsed, sealing dozens of men inside. Some stones bore names and ages. Thomas Green, 28 years. Matthew Coates, 41 years. Others carried only initials, and more than a few read simply, Unknown. On one tilted marker, someone had chiseled a phrase after the fact, brought up but never whole. I knelt to trace the words with my fingers, the grooves sharp against my skin. The phrase gnawed at me. Had they recovered bodies shattered by rockfall? Or had they meant something worse, that what came back wasn't all of the man, that some part of him remained in the dark? The ground around the miners' graves disturbed me most. Soil buckled, cracked, as though something beneath had shifted. At first I thought it was normal erosion, sinkholes from old shafts collapsing, but the pattern was wrong. The ground wasn't sinking, it was heaving upward, splitting clean, as if something had pressed against it from below. I crouched at one grave where the soil had split enough to expose the rotted edge of a coffin. The wood bore marks, splintered outward. My stomach lurched. Those weren't breaks from weight above. They were claw marks, pressed from the inside. That was when I noticed the objects. The grave with the splintered coffin had a toy horse set neatly atop the mound. Carved from wood, its legs worn smooth from handling, its paint still faintly visible. Red saddle, blue bridle. It hadn't been buried and uncovered. It looked placed there, upright, whole. Another grave bore a woman's hand mirror. Its silver backing shone uncorroded despite the damp. No, when I bent close, my reflection warped in its surface. For an instant, I swore I saw another face behind mine, eyes dark, mouth twisted in grief. When I blinked, the image was gone. On another mound lay a Bible. Its pages were open, not yellowed, the words sharp. The passage visible was Psalm 88. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. Elsewhere, a rusted pocket watch, ticking faintly despite the rust. A woman's shawl smelling faintly of smoke. A child's shoe, no larger than my palm, laces tied in a neat bow. The belongings didn't feel like artifacts buried with the dead. They felt like offerings left later, or worse, like the dead had brought them back. I moved deeper into the cemetery, my unease thickening with every step. The silence pressed harder. Each snap of my camera shutter echoed like a gunshot. At the far edge, half hidden in ivy, I found a mausoleum. Small stone, its roof cracked, its iron door crooked on hinges red with rust. The name across the lintel read Hensley, one of Claiborne's oldest families, if diner talk could be trusted. As I approached, the air grew colder. My breath puffed white. The iron door groaned as I shoved it open. Inside, mildew clung thick, stone damp beneath my boots. Coffins lined the walls, stacked too high. Most had collapsed, lids sunken, wood rotted. But one coffin on the far wall was different. Its lid lay shoved aside, half on the floor. The interior was clawed, the stone beneath gouged in jagged furrows. My flashlight beam trembled as I traced them. The scratches didn't stop at the coffin. They dragged across the floor, leading toward the door where I stood. The light flickered. For a heartbeat of darkness, I saw fingers. Long, pale, curling out of the coffin, straining toward me. When the beam steadied, the space was empty. I staggered back into the clearing, my chest tight, my notebook shaking in my hands. Every rational part of me screamed that this was sinkholes, vandalism, tricks of damp light. But the weight in the air, the silence, the offerings, it was something else. The waitress's whisper returned to me. Don't go digging up old grief. It'll dig back. I forced myself to keep walking, snapping photos, recording names. It felt less like documenting and more like leaving proof I'd been there, in case I didn't come back. Near the northern fence, ivy smothered a stone taller than the rest. I brushed the vines aside. Unlike the others, its face was clean, its letters carved sharp, the granite unweathered. It looked fresh, as though cut within the year. The soil at its base split wide, the earth buckled outward. My breath caught as I read the name carved deep. It wasn't just any name. It was my own family's name, cut deep into the granite, fresh as if carved that morning. My mouth went dry. I reached out without meaning to, my fingers trembling against the letters. The grooves were sharp, new. This wasn't the faded etching of a century-old stone. Whoever had carved it had done so recently. Days ago, maybe hours. The date below the name stopped me cold. It wasn't 1904. It wasn't the 1800s. It was this year, this month, and the day was tomorrow. My chest tightened. My pulse hammered in my ears. I read it again, trying to force sense onto it, but there it was. My family name, my bloodline, and a death date that hadn't yet arrived. The soil at the base of the stone shifted, a faint heave, like something beneath was stirring. A line split in the dirt, widening into a crack that bled the smell of damp rot. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over another headstone. That's when I heard it. Not voices, not whispers. A sound deeper, heavier, like the earth groaning in grief. It rolled under my feet, vibrating through the stones, rattling the iron fence. The graves around me seemed to sigh, soil shifting as if they exhaled in unison. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted. My eyes snagged on the offerings left atop the disturbed mounds. The toy horse, the shawl, the Bible. They'd moved. I swear they had. The horse now faced me directly. The shawl had spread wider, as if arms had unfurled. The Bible's pages turned in a wind I couldn't feel, stopping on another verse. For the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee. The mausoleum door groaned open behind me, slowly, as though pushed by a hand too tired for haste. My flashlight beam wavered toward it, and in the crack of shadow I saw movement. Something pale, something long. I bolted. The cemetery blurred around me, stones crowding closer, their names sharper than before. My family's name appeared again and again, on stones I hadn't seen, on markers small and large, all with the same date, tomorrow. My breath hitched, panic clawing my throat. I broke for the gate. The rusted iron sagged open, vines tearing at my clothes. I stumbled down the path, lungs burning, but the hill stretched again, the descent longer than it should have been. My boots slipped on leaves, my knees buckled, but I kept moving, praying I'd see the road, my truck, anything. Instead, I found another clearing. Not the road, not the base of the hill. Another graveyard. Smaller, but arranged the same. Stones tilted, soil cracked, offerings placed neat. At its center, one grave stood fresh, the dirt still loose, the stone clean. My light swept over the name. It was mine, just mine, first, middle, last. No family line, no ambiguity, just me. And below it, the date had changed. It wasn't tomorrow anymore. It was today. My scream tore out of me, raw, echoing into the dark. The ground beneath my boots heaved. The soil split, buckling upward, and pale fingers broke the surface. Long, thin, straining toward the air. They curled, dirt cascading from knuckle to knuckle, until they gripped the edges of the mound and pulled. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, as a figure rose from the grave. Not rotted, not skeletal, whole, familiar. It was me. The face that broke the surface was my own. Eyes closed at first, then snapping open. Eyes too dark, too deep, filled with something that wasn't human grief, but something older, heavier. The mouth opened, gasping like a man taking his first breath. My double sat upright in the grave, dirt sliding from his shoulders. Then he smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just a small, sorrowful curve of lips as though pitying me. His hand reached out, not clawing, not violent, offering. The ground around the cemetery split wider. Coffins groaned as soil cracked, lids shoved aside by pale arms. Figures pulled themselves free, not corpses, not haints, but reflections. Men, women, children, all looking like the stones they'd risen from. They blinked, opened eyes, and turned toward me in unison. The air pressed heavy. The smell of damp rot thickened. My flashlight sputtered, and in the half-dark, their eyes glowed faint, as if holding the last embers of grief. My double's hand reached closer. The voice that came from him wasn't loud, but it wasn't mine either. It was layered, dozens of voices speaking through one mouth. You don't belong above. My legs buckled. My hands clawed at the dirt. I tried to scramble, to flee, but the earth shifted, pulling me downward. Roots wound around my ankles. Soil sucked at my boots. The figures moved closer, their pale hands outstretched, not attacking, welcoming. The waitress's warning rang in my skull. Don't go digging up old grief. It'll dig back. I screamed until my throat tore, but the sound vanished into the heavy air. My flashlight fell, its beam catching my double's face one last time, my face, before the ground swallowed it. And then silence. When I woke, it was daylight. I lay at the base of Ashwood Hill, my truck a few yards away. My pack was still strapped tight. My camera dangled from my neck. Everything looked untouched, except for the dirt beneath my nails. The mud caked on my clothes. And the photo saved on my camera, not one I'd taken, a photo of my own headstone. The date still read today. In every Appalachian town, there's a story folks will only tell you once. Not because they don't remember the details, but because remembering makes them uneasy, like dragging something back out of the dark. In Claiborne, Virginia, that story was the Black River Church. I first heard it from a retired rail worker named Amos, who I met in the diner. He sat across from me, fingers stained yellow from tobacco, voice gravelly as the coal dust that had lined his lungs. I told him I was a writer, looking into Appalachian folklore, cemeteries, ghost towns, all the usual, and he'd given me a long look before finally speaking. You want something worth writing about? He asked. Don't follow the river, not after sundown. When I pressed him, he shook his head. Ain't a story to tell. It's a place, church out there on the banks. Black River Church, folks call it. Don't belong to Methodist or Baptist or nobody. Don't belong to God neither. Place remembers. That's worse. He wouldn't say more. He just drained his coffee, dropped 2 crumpled dollars on the counter, and left me staring at my notebook. Over the next week, I heard fragments. A waitress said her cousin drowned in the river, but no body was ever found. A shopkeeper told me the church wasn't built so much as it just showed up after a flood in the 1920s. A woman at the laundromat whispered that her grandmother had gone to the church one night and come home with white hair, lips trembling, never speaking again. Nobody agreed on details, but they all shared the same tightness in their voices, the same way their eyes flicked toward the south when they said the name, Black River. It didn't show on any map I could find, not on USGS charts, not on county plats, not even in the archives at the courthouse. But when I laid all the locals' descriptions side by side, a shape emerged. A bend south of Claiborne, a hollow where floodwaters pooled, where the soil turned dark as a coal dust. So, one late October evening, I drove until the pavement ended, and the ruts grew too deep for my truck. I walked the rest. The air cooled fast as the sun dropped. The forest pressed close, the undergrowth thick with briars that tugged at my jeans. The only sound was the creek running somewhere ahead, a low murmur that grew heavier as I walked. The path curved downward, mud slicked beneath my boots, until at last the trees parted. There it was. The river ran black in the moonlight. Not dark green, not murky brown, but black, like oil poured across the land. It reflected no stars, no silver sheen. Looking into it was like looking into a hole where the world had been carved out. On the far bank sat the church. It leaned crooked, half sunk into the soil, as though the earth itself was trying to drag it under. Its clapboard walls sagged. Its steeple leaned at an angle too sharp to be safe. The windows were dark, but not empty. There was a weight behind them, the sense of being watched. The river lapped quietly at its steps, and the mud around its foundation glistened as though water seeped upward from beneath instead of down from rain. I should have left then. I should have listened to Amos, to the waitress, to every tight-lipped warning. But curiosity is a hunger that doesn't let go. I stepped closer to the river. The water was still, but not calm. My reflection didn't look right. At first I thought it was the low light, the distortion of the surface, but as I stared, I realized what I was seeing wasn't me as I stood. It was me drowning. My mouth open, bubbles pouring upward, eyes wide, hair floating. I staggered back, heart hammering. But when I looked again, the water was empty, black as before. The church loomed across the way. A narrow footbridge, little more than planks and rope, spanned the river. It sagged in the middle, the boards slick and swollen. I tested the first step, wood creaking under my weight. The river whispered below, faint ripples brushing the boards. Halfway across, I made the mistake of looking down. This time, I didn't see myself drowning. I saw myself sitting in a pew, head bowed, hands folded. Still, I ran the rest of the way. The church door stood crooked on rusted hinges. When I pulled it, it moaned like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and old wood. The pews stretched in neat rows toward the altar. The floor sloped subtly, as though the building were sinking into the earth. And the pews weren't empty. Shapes sat in them. Shadowed forms, faint outlines. Like the suggestion of people. Some leaned forward, heads bowed. Others sat rigid, hands folded. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. But the weight of them pressed on me all the same. I crept down the aisle, every board creaking underfoot. My flashlight beam shook as it swept the pews. The shadows didn't flinch. They just sat, patient, as though waiting for a sermon that would never come. At the altar, a Bible lay open. Its pages were damp, ink blurred, but one verse stood sharp, unmarred. Ecclesiastes 9:5. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. The pews behind me creaked. I spun, the beam of my light jerking across the rows. The shadows had shifted. Not much, just enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. Heads turned. Hands that had been folded now hung at sides. I stumbled backward, my heel striking the altar step. The shadows didn't advance. They only shifted little by little, as though each blink pulled them closer. And then I saw it. Halfway down the left row, fourth pew from the front. A shape clearer than the rest. Shoulders slumped, hands clasped, head bowed. My breath caught, my body locked. Because it wasn't just a shadow. It was me. My own figure sat in that pew, wearing my clothes, hair falling in the same shape, hands folded exactly as mine were trembling. My double didn't raise its head, didn't move. It just sat there, patient, waiting. And when I blinked, I could swear it moved before I did. I froze, breath shallow, as the figure in the pew, my figure, tilted its head the way I hadn't yet, like it knew the move before I made it. My knees went weak. Every instinct screamed to bolt for the door, but the aisle stretched long and the air was thick as syrup. My double sat perfectly still, hands clasped, shoulders slumped in patient reverence. But when I blinked, its hands unfolded. My own fingers twitched in response, too late, as if my body were trying to catch up to something that had already decided what I'd do. I stumbled backward, shoulder hitting the altar. The Bible fell shut with a heavy thud that echoed through the church. The congregation of shadows stirred. Not much, just the faint creak of pews, the suggestion of bodies leaning forward. A breath of movement, heavy as a sigh. My flashlight beam swept across them and caught nothing but silhouettes. Not transparent like ghosts, not solid like people, but something in between. They absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. And then the church groaned. Not the wood, not the foundation. The church itself. The sound came from the walls, the floor, the steeple, all at once. A long, mournful creak, like a body stretching old bones. Dust sifted down from the rafters, drifting in the beam of my light. Behind me, the river lapped against the foundation, louder now, closer, as if the waterline had risen. I forced myself toward the door, boots scraping on warped boards. But halfway down the aisle, I stopped dead. The door was gone. Where the sagging wooden door had been, there was only wall. Clapboard gray and crooked, no seam, no hinges, no exit. My chest tightened. I turned in a circle. The windows, too, were wrong. Where I'd seen black glass before, I now saw water pressing against them, black river lapping high as the sills. And in that water, reflection shimmered. Not of me, not of the church, but of faces. Pale, bloated, mouths open in drowned screams. They stared at me through the glass, their hair floating, their hands slapping silently against the panes. The pews creaked again. My double was standing now. It rose smooth, slow, no effort in its movement. It faced me, head still bowed. When it lifted its face, my stomach lurched. It was me, but emptied. The eyes were mine, but darker, hollows filled with depthless shadow. The mouth was set in a sorrowful curve, pitying, patient, like someone watching a child who doesn't yet understand what's coming. And when it stepped into the aisle, the congregation followed. Dozens of shadowed figures rose from their pews, moving in unison. Not rushing, not lunging, just rising, turning, beginning a slow march toward me. Their feet made no sound. The boards beneath them didn't creak. They moved like memory replaying itself, inevitable, unchangeable. I backed toward the altar, heart pounding. My flashlight trembled in my hand, beam jittering across faces that weren't faces, hands that weren't hands. The Bible lay on the floor where it had fallen, pages open again, though I hadn't touched it. This time the verse was different. The memory of them is forgotten. But I wasn't forgotten. I was remembered, and that was worse. The church groaned again, louder, and the walls bowed inward. Water seeped between the boards, trickling down like tears. The black river was rising, pressing itself inside. The drowned faces outside the windows began to multiply, crowding, pressing their pale foreheads against the glass. I turned back to the aisle. My double stood closest now, only a few yards away. It raised its hand, my hand, and pointed toward the altar. The wood beneath my boots shuddered. With a cracking groan, the floor split, boards yawning apart. Below wasn't soil or foundation. It was water. Black water, rising fast, swallowing splinters and nails. I stumbled back, boots skidding on slick wood, until my heels hit the altar. The shadow congregation advanced step by step as water filled the church from below. The pews began to float, wood groaning, tipping as the river claimed them. Yet the shadows sat steady upon them, unmoving, like memories pinned in place. My flashlight slipped from my hand and tumbled into the water with a hiss. Darkness swallowed the church, broken only by the faint glow from the windows where drowned faces pressed, watching. The first touch came at my ankle. Cold. Too cold. Fingers wrapping tight, pulling. I kicked, but the grip didn't break. Another hand caught my calf. Another my wrist. They weren't the shadows now. They were the drowned faces from the windows, the forgotten dead, pulling themselves inside, hauling me down. My double still stood in the aisle, untouched by the water. Its lips parted. For the first time, it spoke. "You're already here." The voice wasn't mine. It was layered. Countless voices woven together, men and women and children, old and young, a chorus of grief that rattled the boards. I screamed, thrashing, but the water surged higher, sucking me under. My lungs burned as I kicked, fought, clawed, but the grip of the dead was unbreakable. My last glimpse above the surface was my double turning away, walking calmly back to its pew as the water closed over my head. I expected blackness. I expected death. Instead, I saw memory. Not mine. The church's. I saw the miners clawing at stone in 1904, lungs collapsing, eyes bulging as air turned to dust. I saw their wives weeping at the riverbank, tossing flowers that floated briefly before sinking. I saw floods sweeping cabins away, mothers clutching infants until the current tore them loose. I saw soldiers in blue and gray both, lying unburied in mountain hollows, their last gasps rising like steam into the trees. All of it played out at once, layered, endless. The river held it. The church remembered it. And now I was inside it. My chest burned. I needed air. But when I opened my mouth, black water poured in, cold as stone. And with it came voices, hundreds, thousands, whispering not words but grief. Wails of loss, cries of hunger, laments of the forgotten. They filled me, pressed against my skull until I thought it would crack. I don't know how long I drifted in that flood of memory. Time didn't hold. Seconds stretched into centuries. Centuries collapsed into moments. Faces blurred into one another. My own face appeared again and again, drowning, sitting in pews, walking into the river. And then the bells tolled, faint at first, then louder, deeper, shaking the water around me. Not from above, from below, bells tolling in the depths as though a cathedral lay, submerged in the black. With each toll, the congregation of shadows turned their heads toward me. My double stood among them, lips still curved in that pitying smile. The bells grew louder, unbearable until my skull rattled with each strike. Then silence. I woke on the riverbank. The church was gone. No steeple, no clapboards, no sagging foundation. Only black water lapping at mud. My clothes clung heavy with damp. My lungs burned as though I'd nearly drowned. My camera lay beside me, mud streaked but intact. I staggered to my feet, staring at the river. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the water rippled. A reflection shimmered. Not mine as I stood. Mine sitting in a pew, hands folded, eyes closed. Behind me, pews full of shadows, faces I didn't recognize but would never forget. The reflection raised its head. Its eyes met mine, and it smiled. I left Claiborne that night, driving until the mountains faded behind me. But the Black River hasn't left me. Every night since, I hear it in my dreams. The water lapping, the congregation stirring, the bells tolling deep below. And sometimes, when I wake before dawn, I see the shimmer of black water on my bedroom floor, rippling as though waiting. The church remembers, and now so do I.